"This is the biggest I've seen," Adelaide Bergstrom gasped, her 6'2" frame trembling as she stood in the doorway of the Montana cabin, staring at something that made her Nordic blue eyes fill with tears. The giant mail-order bride had traveled 1,800 miles from Minnesota to marry a rancher she'd never met, a man whose advertisement promised height no obstacle and a fresh start. But Wyatt McKenna, the towering rancher who stood 6'7" with shoulders that blocked out the sunset, couldn't meet her gaze. The giant mail-order bride had expected a simple homestead, perhaps loneliness, maybe hard work. What she found instead made her gasp those words, "This is the biggest I've seen," with a mixture of wonder and heartbreak that would change both their lives forever. The rancher hesitated at her reaction, his massive hands shaking, his weathered face twisted with shame because he was about to do something horrifying. Something that would either destroy the giant mail-order bride's dreams of belonging, or reveal a truth so powerful it would test whether two broken souls could ever truly find home. 3 weeks earlier, Adelaide had been sitting in a cramped boarding house in St. Paul, Minnesota, reading the same advertisement for the 100th time. Her calloused fingers traced the words printed in the matrimonial news like they were scripture. Rancher, Montana Territory, seeking companionship. Must appreciate solitude, hard work, and God's creation. Height no obstacle. Those last 3 words had made her hands shake. Height no obstacle. In 32 years of living, no one had ever said those words to her. Not her mother, who'd apologized to neighbors for having such a freakishly tall daughter. Not her late husband, Carl, who'd married her because he needed a strong back for his failing farm, then spent 5 years reminding her that real women were supposed to be delicate. Not the church ladies who'd whispered that God had cursed her with size as punishment for some unnamed sin. Adelaide had spent her whole life making herself smaller, hunching her shoulders, bending her knees, speaking quietly, taking up less space. But Carl was 3 years dead from pneumonia. The farm was sold to pay his debts, and she had exactly $47 to her name and nowhere that felt like home. So she'd written to the rancher. She'd poured her heart onto paper, telling him about her Swedish grandmother who taught her to read, about her love of prairie sunsets and honest work, about how she'd always felt like a stranger in her own skin. She didn't mention her height. She figured he'd find out soon enough and send her packing like everyone else eventually did. But Wyatt McKenna's reply had been different. He'd written in careful, blocky handwriting that he understood what it meant to never quite fit. That Montana was big enough for big people, that loneliness was worse than solitude, and he'd rather have honest companionship than pretty lies. He'd sent her train fare, $43 in crisp bills that smelled like hope. And now, here she was, standing in the Silver Creek General Store, watching the tallest man she'd ever seen loading her carpet bag into a wagon. Wyatt McKenna wasn't just tall, he was a mountain of a man, with hands that could palm a watermelon and a voice like distant thunder. But it was his eyes that caught her, soft brown eyes that held the same loneliness she saw in her mirror every morning, the same wariness of someone who'd been hurt for simply existing. The wagon ride to his ranch took 4 hours. 4 hours of Montana wilderness so beautiful it made her chest ache. Rolling plains stretched to purple mountains. Aspens whispered secrets in the wind. A hawk circled overhead crying out to the endless sky. And Wyatt talked, not small talk, real talk, about how his Norwegian grandfather had homesteaded this land in 1852, about how the McKenna men had always been giants, and how that had made them valuable for labor, but feared for their strength. About how he'd built this ranch with his own hands after his father died, and how some nights the silence was so thick he could barely breathe through it. Adelaide listened and felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been frozen since Carl died, maybe since before that. She told him about her grandmother's stories of the old country, about how she'd loved Carl but never felt cherished by him, about how she'd always dreamed of a place where she could stand up straight and not apologize. Wyatt's hands tightened on the reins. "You don't ever have to make yourself small here, Adelaide. Not on my land, not in my home." When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was setting, painting everything gold and crimson. The cabin was sturdy pine logs with a stone chimney. The barn smelled like hay and horses. Greek water sang somewhere close. It was simple. It was beautiful. It was more than Adelaide had dared to hope for. Wyatt helped her down from the wagon, and for the first time in her life, Adelaide had to reach up slightly to take a man's hand. Something in her chest loosened, like she'd been holding her breath for 32 years and could finally exhale. That first evening, they ate beef stew and cornbread at a hand-hewn table. Wyatt was nervous. She could see it in how carefully he moved, like he was afraid of taking up too much space. She understood that fear intimately. After supper, they sat on the porch and watched stars emerge. More stars than Adelaide had ever seen. The Milky Way stretched overhead like God had spilled diamonds across black velvet. "I should tell you something," Wyatt said quietly. His voice was tight, afraid. "Before you decide to stay. Before you—" He stopped. Started again. "I'm not the man the town thinks I am, Adelaide. 7 years ago, I did something. Something violent. Something I can't take back." Adelaide's heart beat faster, but she didn't move away. She'd learned that running from truth never solved anything. "Tell me," she said simply. Wyatt's hands gripped the porch railing so hard the wood creaked. In the starlight, Adelaide could see his knuckles had gone white. "I was engaged once," he said, and his voice sounded like it was being dragged over broken glass. "Sarah Pritchard, banker's daughter. Pretty little thing, barely came up to my chest. Everyone in Silver Creek said we were a strange match, but her father saw opportunity. My land plus his money made sense on paper." He paused, and Adelaide heard him swallow hard. "I thought I loved her. Maybe I just loved the idea that someone small and delicate could want someone like me. Made me feel less like a freak, you know. Made me feel normal for the first time in my life." The night wind whispered through the aspens. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out. Adelaide stayed quiet, letting him find his words. "One Saturday night I was in town picking up supplies. Sarah was with me. This drifter, stranger passing through. He'd been drinking at the saloon. He said something to Sarah, something crude, something no man should say to any woman." Wyatt's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I saw red, Adelaide. I didn't think. I just reacted. I grabbed him, threw him against the hitching post. He came at me swinging, and I hit him just once. One punch." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. "He went down like a felled tree. Didn't get up. Folks had to carry him to the doctor. He lived, but he was never right again. Brain injury. Can't remember his own name some days. Can't hold down work. He left town eventually, but the damage was done. To him, to me, to everything." Adelaide's chest tightened. She could picture it so clearly. This gentle giant pushed too far, his size turning into a weapon he never meant to draw. "Sarah looked at me different after that," Wyatt continued. "Like I was dangerous. Like I was some kind of monster waiting to explode. She broke off the engagement 2 weeks later. Her father called in a loan I'd taken to expand the herd. Nearly bankrupted me. Took me 3 years to pay it back. And the whole town. They decided I was violent, unstable. Mothers pulled their children across the street when they saw me coming. Men stopped talking when I walked into the general store. The sheriff told me it'd be best if I stayed out of town, unless absolutely necessary." His voice cracked. "And the worst part, Adelaide? The absolute worst part? I was relieved when Sarah left, because I realized I didn't love her. I loved what she represented, acceptance, normalcy, a chance to pretend I wasn't what I am. I used her just like she used me. And a man's life got destroyed because of my pride." He finally turned to look at Adelaide, and in the moonlight she could see tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. This mountain of a man, crying like a lost child. "So, you see, I put that advertisement in the paper because no decent woman in Montana territory would have me. Because I'm a violent man who can't control his temper. Because I'm alone for good reason. And you deserve to know that before you unpack your bags. Before you decide if you want to stay in a house with a man who nearly killed someone with his bare hands." The confession hung in the air between them like gunsmoke. Adelaide's mind was racing, her heart pounding. She thought about Carl, who'd never raised his hand, but had killed her spirit with 1,000 small cruelties. She thought about her father, who'd abandoned them when she was 8, because he couldn't handle having a daughter who towered over him by age 12. She thought about the preacher back in St. Paul, who told her that women of unnatural size must have unnatural souls to match. Everyone had always told Adelaide who she was supposed to be. No one had ever asked who she actually was. And now here was Wyatt, laying his darkest moment at her feet, giving her every reason to leave, terrified she'd see him the way everyone else did. But Adelaide had spent 32 years being judged for things she couldn't control. She knew the difference between a monster and a man who'd made a terrible mistake. "Did you apologize?" she asked quietly. Wyatt blinked, surprised by the question. "What? To the drifter? Did you try to make it right?" I tried. He was gone before I could. I sent money through the sheriff to help with his care, but I don't know if he ever got it. I prayed for him every night for 3 years. Still do sometimes. But I can't undo what I did, Adelaide. I can't take back that moment." Adelaide stood up from her chair. Wyatt flinched slightly, like he expected her to walk away. Instead, she moved closer, close enough that she could smell leather and honest sweat and wood smoke on him, close enough to see the fear in his eyes. "Wyatt McKenna," she said softly. "I was married to a man who never hit me once, never raised his voice, never broke a single law. But he broke me every single day with his disappointment, with his contempt, with the way he made me feel like I was a burden he was forced to carry." Her voice strengthened. "You made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But you've carried that guilt for 7 years. You've isolated yourself, punished yourself, and you're so afraid of your own strength that you move through the world like you're apologizing for existing." She reached out and placed her hand over his on the railing. His hand was twice the size of hers, scarred and calloused from years of hard work. It was shaking. "I don't know what kind of man you are yet, Wyatt. We just met. But I know what kind of man you're trying to be. And I think that counts for something. I think that counts for a lot." Wyatt's breath caught. "You're not afraid of me?" "I'm terrified," Adelaide admitted honestly. "But not of you hitting me. I'm afraid of hoping again. I'm afraid of believing that maybe I could have a home here. I'm afraid that I'll start to feel safe, and then you'll realize I'm too tall, too opinionated, too much, and I'll be right back where I started, alone and apologizing for existing." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I'm afraid of the same thing you are, Wyatt. I'm afraid of being seen and still being rejected." The silence between them shifted, became something else. Something tender and terrifying and true. "I see you, Adelaide," Wyatt whispered. "And what I see is the bravest woman I've ever met. You traveled 1,800 miles to start over with a stranger. You're standing here listening to my confession instead of running. His voice broke. "You're not making yourself small. Not physically. Not in spirit. And that's the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed." Adelaide's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "Then let's make a deal," she said. "We both stop apologizing for being who we are. We both stop punishing ourselves for things we can't change. And we see if two people who never fit anywhere else might actually fit together. No promises, no expectations, just honesty and a chance." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, carefully, like he was handling something precious and fragile, he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His hand engulfed hers, but somehow it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt right, like two puzzle pieces that had been cut from the same board, finally finding each other. "I'd like that," he whispered. "I'd like that more than anything in this world." They stood there on the porch, two giants under an endless Montana sky, holding hands like teenagers at their first dance. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, neither of them felt alone. But they didn't know yet what was waiting inside that cabin. They didn't know about the letter hidden in Wyatt's desk drawer. They didn't know that in 3 weeks everything would come to a head in a way that would test whether this fragile new beginning could survive the weight of the past. The next 3 weeks passed like a dream Adelaide was afraid to wake from. Every morning, she'd open her eyes in the small bedroom Wyatt had given her, the one with the window facing east, so she could watch the sunrise, paint the mountains pink and gold. And for a few seconds, she'd forget where she was. Then she'd smell coffee brewing and hear Wyatt moving quietly in the kitchen, trying not to wake her, and she'd remember. She was home, or at least she was learning what home might feel like. They fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Wyatt would be up before dawn, tending the cattle and horses, mending fences, hauling water from the creek. Adelaide would take over the cabin, scrubbing floors that hadn't been properly cleaned in years, mending shirts with holes big enough to fit her fist through, cooking meals that actually had vegetables instead of just meat and beans. She planted herbs in the kitchen garden. She organized the chaos of Wyatt's pantry. She hung curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks to soften the harsh afternoon light. Slowly, carefully, she was turning his bachelor quarters into something that felt like a home. But it was the evenings that meant everything. After supper, they'd sit on the porch and talk. Really talk. About everything and nothing. Wyatt told her about his childhood. How his father had been even bigger than him. How they'd always been treated like workhorses instead of people. How his mother had died when he was 12, and his father had retreated into silence and whiskey. Adelaide shared stories about her grandmother, the Swedish immigrant who'd taught her that being tall was a gift from God, not a curse. About how she'd loved reading, but could never afford books. About how she'd married Carl not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of being alone forever, fear of being a burden on her aging mother, fear that no one else would ever want her. "I was so desperate to be chosen," Adelaide whispered one evening, watching stars emerge. "I didn't stop to think about whether I was choosing him back, whether I actually wanted the life he was offering. I was so grateful someone would have me that I said yes without thinking." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I did the same thing with Sarah. I was so shocked that a pretty, normal-sized woman would want me that I ignored every sign that we didn't actually fit. That we were just using each other to feel less alone." Adelaide turned to look at him. In the fading light, his profile was all strong lines and gentle angles. "Is that what we're doing, Wyatt? Using each other?" He met her eyes, and the honesty there took her breath away. "I don't think so. But I'm scared, Adelaide. I'm scared that one day you'll wake up and realize you made a mistake. That you'll see me the way Sarah did. That you'll—" "Stop," Adelaide interrupted gently. She reached over and took his hand. It had become easier these past weeks, touching him, learning the landscape of his calloused palms, the warmth of his skin, the way his fingers would curl around hers like he was afraid she'd disappear. "I'm scared too. I'm scared every single day. But fear isn't a reason to not try. Fear is just proof that we're risking something real." Wyatt squeezed her hand. "When did you get so wise?" "When I spent 3 years sitting at a dead man's bedside, watching him slip away, and realized I'd never actually known him. Never let him know me. We were married for 5 years and remained strangers." Her voice caught. "I don't want that again, Wyatt. I don't want to waste whatever time we have being strangers. I want to know you, the real you, not the version you think you should be." Something shifted in Wyatt's expression, like a door opening. "Then come with me," he said suddenly, standing up. "There's something I need to show you." He led her into the cabin, through the main room with its stone fireplace and hand-hewn furniture, past the kitchen where tomorrow's bread was rising in a bowl covered with cloth, and into his small office, a room Adelaide had never entered. It wasn't forbidden. She'd just respected his privacy, but now Wyatt was opening his desk drawer with trembling hands, pulling out a yellowed envelope, and Adelaide's heart started racing. "This came 2 weeks before you arrived," Wyatt said quietly, holding the envelope like it might burn him. "It's from Sarah Pritchard. My former fiancée." Adelaide's breath caught. "What does it say?" "I don't know. I haven't opened it." Wyatt's voice was raw. "I've been too afraid. Afraid she's writing to tell me she's married and happy and I'm just a bad memory. Afraid she's writing to curse me. Afraid she's writing to ask for something I can't give. So I hid it, pretended it didn't exist. But it's been eating at me, Adelaide. Every day I see that drawer and I know the letter's in there, and I'm too much of a coward to face whatever it says." Adelaide looked at the envelope, then at Wyatt, at this giant of a man who'd been brought to his knees by fear and guilt and the weight of his own past. "Do you want me here when you read it?" she asked softly. "Or do you need privacy?" "I want you here," Wyatt said immediately. "I need you here, because whatever it says, I need someone to—" His voice broke. "I need someone who sees me the way you do, not as a monster, not as a mistake, just as a man trying his best." Adelaide's eyes burned with tears. "Then open it, Wyatt, face it. Whatever it says, we'll face it together." Wyatt's hands shook so badly he could barely break the seal. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, covered in elegant feminine handwriting. Adelaide watched his eyes move across the words, watched his face go pale, watched a single tear slip down his cheek. "What does it say?" she whispered. Wyatt's voice was barely audible. "She's dying, consumption. She has maybe 6 months left, and she's asking me to forgive her." "Forgive her? For what?" "For being a coward, for running when I needed someone to believe in me, for letting her father destroy my reputation and nearly take my ranch, for—" He paused, reading further. "For not understanding that one mistake doesn't define a man's entire character. She says she's spent 7 years watching her husband. She married a lawyer from Helena, and realizing that a man who never gets angry isn't necessarily a good man, just a cold one. She says she wishes she'd been brave enough to stay, to fight for me instead of running. She says she's sorry, and she hopes I've found happiness, and she's asking if I can forgive her before she dies." The letter trembled in his hands. "She says the drifter, the man I hurt, he found work in Helena, opened a small shop. He's doing okay. Not perfect, but okay. She tracked him down to ask about me, to see if I'd ever tried to make amends. He told her about the money I sent, about the letters I wrote. He said he forgave me years ago, said anger takes more energy than he's got." Adelaide couldn't breathe. The weight of it all, the guilt Wyatt had carried, the fear that had shaped 7 years of his life, the isolation he'd chosen as penance. And now, this. Forgiveness from the 2 people he'd thought would hate him forever. "Oh, Wyatt," she whispered. Wyatt crumpled. This mountain of a man just folded in on himself, sliding down to sit on the floor with his back against the desk, Sarah's letter clutched in his shaking hands. Sobs tore from his chest, deep, wrenching sounds that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and wounded. Adelaide dropped to her knees beside him and pulled him into her arms. It was awkward. He was so much bigger than her, but she held him anyway, cradling his head against her shoulder while he cried 7 years of grief and guilt and loneliness into her dress. "It's okay," she murmured, stroking his hair. "It's okay. Let it out. Let it all out." "I don't deserve this," Wyatt gasped between sobs. "I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't deserve you. I don't deserve—" "Stop," Adelaide said firmly. She pulled back enough to cup his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You made a mistake. A terrible, costly mistake. But you've paid for it, Wyatt. You've paid for it in isolation and guilt and 7 years of punishing yourself. And now, the people you hurt most are telling you it's okay to stop carrying this. It's okay to put it down. It's okay to forgive yourself." Wyatt stared at her, tears streaming down his weathered face. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I know what it's like to carry guilt that isn't yours to carry," Adelaide said, her own tears falling now. "I blame myself for Carl's death, for not being a good enough wife, for not loving him the way he deserved, for being relieved when he died because it meant I was finally free. I carried that guilt for 3 years, Wyatt, and it nearly destroyed me. Until one day, I realized that guilt without purpose is just another form of pride. It's saying that my pain matters more than forgiveness, that my judgment matters more than grace." She pressed her forehead against his. "Let it go, Wyatt. Whatever you're holding on to, whatever you think you deserve, let it go. Choose to live instead of just surviving. Choose to believe that maybe, just maybe, you're worthy of happiness, of love, of a second chance." Wyatt's arms came around her, pulling her close. They knelt there on the office floor, two broken people holding each other together, while outside the Montana night sang with crickets and wind and the distant howl of coyotes. And something inside both of them shifted, healed, became whole in a way neither had thought possible. But they still didn't know what Adelaide would discover the next morning. They didn't know that her gasp, "This is the biggest I've seen," would come not from horror, but from overwhelming, devastating joy. They didn't know that Wyatt's hesitation would be born not from shame, but from the terrifying vulnerability of offering everything he had, and fearing it wouldn't be enough. They didn't know that the horrifying thing he was about to do would change both their lives forever. Adelaide woke before dawn, but Wyatt's side of the cabin was already quiet. She dressed quickly, pulling on her work dress and boots, and went searching for him. The barn was empty. The horses whinnied softly in their stalls. She walked toward the creek, following instinct more than logic, and that's when she saw him. Wyatt stood at the edge of the water, holding something in his hands. Something that caught the first rays of sunlight and threw golden fire across the creek bed. Adelaide's breath stopped. She moved closer, her boots crunching on gravel, and Wyatt turned. His face was raw with vulnerability, terrified and hopeful all at once. In his massive hands he held a ring. Not just any ring. He'd carved it himself from a piece of Montana agate, polishing the stone until it glowed with bands of gold and amber and deep earth brown. The craftsmanship was exquisite. He must have worked on it for weeks, maybe months. "This is the biggest I've seen," Adelaide gasped. But she wasn't talking about the ring. She was talking about his heart, about the enormity of what he was offering, about the courage it took for a man who'd been rejected and feared and isolated to stand here holding out everything he had, his land, his heart, his broken, beautiful self, and ask her to stay forever. Wyatt hesitated. His hands shook so hard the ring trembled. "I know it's too soon," he said, his voice cracking. "I know we've only known each other 3 weeks. I know I have no right to ask. But Adelaide, He stopped, swallowed, started again. "I'm about to do something horrifying, something that might make you run. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel. I can't keep protecting myself from the possibility of pain. You taught me that." He dropped to one knee. This giant of a man, kneeling in the creek gravel like he was praying. Maybe he was. "Adelaide Bergstrom, I love you. I love how you stand tall instead of making yourself small. I love how you see past my size to who I actually am. I love how you turned my house into a home. I love how you made me believe I deserve forgiveness. I love you, and it terrifies me, and I'm asking anyway." His voice broke completely. "Will you marry me? Not because you're desperate, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose me, because you want to build a life here, because maybe, just maybe, we fit together in a way neither of us ever fit anywhere else." Tears streamed down Adelaide's face. This was it. This was the horrifying thing, the terrifying vulnerability of asking for love without guarantees, of offering everything and risking complete rejection. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, stronger, "Yes, Wyatt McKenna, yes." She pulled him to his feet and kissed him like he was air and she'd been drowning. He lifted her off the ground. Finally, someone strong enough to lift her, and spun her in a circle while the Montana sun rose behind them, painting everything gold. Two giants who'd spent their whole lives apologizing for existing, finally home. Finally whole, finally free. The ring fit perfectly, like it was always meant to be there, like they were always meant to find each other. And when Wyatt carried her back to the cabin, both of them laughing and crying at once, Adelaide knew with bone-deep certainty that she'd never have to make herself small again. She could stand tall. She could take up space. She could be loved exactly as she was. That was the biggest thing she'd ever seen. And it was more than enough.